What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. Are you ready to feel old? Well, this very month, the games Pokémon X and Y will be 10 years old. That's right, the very first Pokémon titles on the 3DS have now been out for a decade in 2023. Of course, that means Ruby and Sapphire are now over 20 years old, but we're not talking about that now. The jump off of the limited DS hardware provided a fully rendered 3D experience for better or for worse. See, as impressive as some of their feats were, the Kalos games have, in the best case, had a mixed reception as time goes on. But let's take a look back at the whole thing and really evaluate if that less than stellar reputation is warranted or not. Firstly, let's consider the Pokémon themselves. Now, you might not think that new hardware is connected to the Pokémon designs, but with the new 3D capabilities of the X and Y games, the basic shapes of Pokémon could be far different than the limitations that sprite work affords. Just look at Froakie's slender limbs compared to the more stubby options of water types in generations past. Gen 6 was not the start of people saying that the art style doesn't look like Pokémon, but it did become apparent that they were leaning in a new direction for the general art design. It's funny that this seems more pronounced in the base stages, being far different than past counterparts, while the later evolutions seem to have more pleasing proportions and honestly more of a classic feel with the eyes or faces. But whether you like the art style shift or not, you have to admit that Kalos brought in some great new Pokémon, with the likes of Sylveon, Trevenant, the Fossils, Florges, Aegislash, and more. Well, not too many more, because there was a downside to this fancy new graphics system, that being that either they couldn't or didn't want to create that many new Pokémon. You could make a solid argument for quality over quantity here, but only having 70 new Pokémon, the fewest of any region up to that point or since, makes it seem far too restrictive. And if you didn't like the direction that they've gone, there is so little variety that you're just out of luck. Also, this obviously severely cuts down on certain types being represented in the new roster, but since they brought back so many old ones, a direct response to the backlash of Black and White's exclusivity, they might not have thought that was as important. However, they also added a new type with Fairy. This not only brought in fresh blood, but also created greater balance across the types, finally bringing in an answer to Dragon, and also having an actual reason to use Poison and Steel offenses. But as long as we're comparing it to the Gen 5 games, X and Y look incredible. Some people might take issue with the continuation of the top-down perspective, but I don't see that as a problem, and truthfully, I see it as a strength. Scarlet and Violet suffer from trying to do it all at once, but when you purposefully narrow down your focus to certain areas, you get a lot more polish on the things that you want to show off. And indeed, Kalos had specific spots made just to display the kinds of environments that could now be created when crafting such a carefully curated world. Not that every frame was jaw-dropping, but split-level paths both being in view like Route 8, or brand new areas like Reflection Cave weren't really possible before. There were also advances in cities such as Koraway Town, and then several of the gyms changing how we think about the axis of movement with seemingly such limited inputs. And then of course there's Lumio City, which was the first ever controlled camera in the Pokémon series, letting you roam around as you pleased. Although this is a bit deceptive since Lumios has a lot more buildings than you're actually allowed to explore, but even then there are alleyways and secrets that you can uncover if you take the time to look. This is true of the region as a whole, but most of the rewards that you would find aren't going to be worth your time, with most just being a few steps beyond a cut bush. So then I guess a valid criticism would be to say that Kalos looks pretty, but is a bit hollow. That could go for the map in general, or the battle system if you want. The notorious power plant being locked forever is emblematic of the appealing facade that stands for most of the region, looking nice but lacking deeper substance. Like perhaps the more satisfying exploration of generations past, where you can actually discover something worthwhile. And this perceived emptiness is largely why people expected a Z version to follow up on their decent foundation, well, that and the lack of any post-game to speak of, which made it all the more disappointing when that never materialized. However, that doesn't mean that X and Y were fully lacking in gameplay. They had some niche ideas crop up, like Sky Battles, which I think they kind of expected to be a lot bigger than they ended up being, but more famously, Gen 6 introduced Mega Evolution. It's almost funny to me how people simultaneously griped that Gen 6 wasn't good enough, but also laud Mega Evolution as the greatest thing to ever happen to the series. How can you even separate the two in your mind? The entire Kalos region is fully devoted to this new battle mechanic, with the professor studying it and one of the gym leaders basically being a priestess for it, giving you a freebie gift and even the main villain's plan revolving around the energy effect that creates the phenomenon in the first place. So for the large contingent of fans clamoring for Megas to come back, you have X and Y to thank for that. And maybe, just maybe, those games might be worth a second look to you. Also, Kalos was the first time we ever got real ride Pokémon. It wouldn't be a full-blown feature until Alola, but we got to actually surf on a Lapras, not some generic sprite version of it, as well as ride several land creatures like the Gogoat line and even Mamoswine through the tundra. That's a characteristic of every single modern game in some fashion, and it got its start right here in X and Y. Not that it was perfect, but it made the world feel so much richer and real with those kinds of details included. But while we're talking about game functionality, I think it's only fair to mention one of the greatest innovations, the PSS. The player search system was a brilliant way of finding nearby players, letting you pretty much instantly trade or battle with anyone because you have a whole line of them visually in front of you. Also letting you know when your friends that you've already interacted with are currently online. Maybe you don't care about just a menu, but every subsequent version of this sort of connectivity feature has been worse, requiring far more effort with less payoff, like the Festival Plaza or whatever Scarlet and Violet are trying to force on us. And of course, we can't forget their version of the GTS. This was the easiest way to ever trade across the globe. All you needed was a Wi-Fi connection, which you could find at any McDonald's or your local library, and you didn't have to pay to access it. But while we're talking about it, it is worth noting that X and Y clearly made the best use of the secondary screen inherent on the system. Diamond and Pearl had a couple of quick menu shortcuts, I guess, and Black and White pretty much had nothing to do on their dual screen. But not only did Gen 6 bring the PSS, but the bottom screen also allowed us to have Pokémon Ami, which combined the 3D graphics and the touchscreen to bring our Pokémon to life in a way never done before. The bottom screen also allowed the super training mechanic, which made EVs a lot easier to manage and more accessible than ever to casual players. And let us not forget that X and Y introduced horde battles as well, which was frankly awesome, turning a triple battle into you versus everyone. I honestly think that these kinds of quality of life improvements are the main reason that people were disappointed that there was no follow-up version, because they were fun to play, but maybe the story wasn't quite the best that it could be. I mean, there were certainly cool lore implications, like with the Pokeball Factory, but Team Flare is just about the worst evil team in the franchise. And the group of rivals was a nice attempt, but they didn't really land for anyone out there. It's one thing to maybe want a redo of Diamond and Pearl because the games run too slowly and there are no fire types to speak of, but it's another to want to play in the same engine, just with a more engaging story. Which I think, whether people want to admit it or not, is the case for the Kalos games. Of course, then cue people talking about how they ruined everything because they were too easy compared to Black and White. Now, it is true that the Unova games had an unlockable challenge mode that is not in Gen 6, but if you're talking about the EXP share, you're just wrong. Firstly, the EXP all was an item back in Gen 1, so it's not unprecedented to behave this way, but furthermore, in Kalos, you can turn it off. If you don't want all of your Pokemon gaining experience, you can just shut it down with the press of a button, no problem. Now, if you want to talk about how the starters begin the game with boosted stab attacks, or the fact that most trainers have no more than 3 Pokemon, if that, then we can have a conversation. Or, you know, maybe it's the fact that you keep breaking out Mega Evolution to beat that level 25 base stage Pokemon, just a thought. But players take drastic steps of self-imposed challenges like Nuzlocke all the time. It is far easier to ensure that the Kalos region is a bit more difficult by just not using that extra starter they give you. But then I guess the question remains, do Pokemon X and Y hold up? Well, on the con side, there is the somewhat lacking story, and then once it gets accused of getting interesting, it's all just one long speech by AZ near the end. The region feeling rather empty in places, as well as a limited pool of newly created Pokémon, with the possibility of being a tad easy at times. The pros would be the visual improvements, along with the increased mobility, adding in diagonal movement and roller skates to get around, as well as quality Pokémon designs, with maybe a few outliers here and there, but also the inclusion of Mega Evolution that everyone loved, with upgraded wireless communications and touchscreen interface, the additions of riding Pokémon, and a brand new type for the first time since Gold and Silver. So I suppose you could say that X and Y were decently polished games, certainly compared to modern standards in that regard, that might not be the most engaging on a story level, but they feel decent to play, enough for people to have wanted more to come from it. But even with a world that wasn't quite as fleshed out as we might have hoped, it also basically laid the foundation for everything that a modern Pokémon game would be, with many of the bones of the up-to-date versions tracing back to good old Generation 6, with things as simple as character customization getting their start right here. So, do the games hold up? Well, not entirely. It can be fun at times if you just want to relax, just like any older generation could, but similarly there are some clear growing pains that you're going to have to endure. However, saying that X and Y were empty messes isn't quite the whole picture either, since they are pretty much the start of what the current Pokémon games are all about, being the biggest innovation to the series since the first generation itself. For that alone, I would recommend playing them, but I cannot deny that they can still be pretty tedious after being out for a decade now, so let's hope that we can get a remake of some sort going to remedy that pretty soon. But what do you think of X and Y 10 years later? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded.